Good morning, good afternoon, evening, good night, everyone who's attending from different time zones. Uh, Thank you to Shalom, Fez, the whole Android Worldwide team, and Ryan for giving the opportunity to present today. Um, my name is Ishan, and I hope you and everyone you care about is doing great. And I will be presenting today this talk called Performing Due Diligence as Android Engineers. Um, so first, a little bit introduction, what the talk is about. In a nutshell, it's about considering things that we often tend to miss as engineers. Doesn't matter career. When we're integrating with third-party SDKs or vendors, and um, this is something which sounds very trivial, but it is actually a lot of things to consider, and that's the reason why I'm giving this talk today. Having worked on multiple projects that have involved integration with third-party SDKs, like a bunch of you might have already done here, um, I came up with a framework that sort of is like a set of questions that I have been posed in the past by my colleagues, management, and leaders at my org to understand if there are any risks going forward with that particular SDK. And having all those things clubbed together in this presentation, I believe is going to be valuable for others that are listening today to save time, money, and also prevent frustration along the way for your future self and myself. So what are the things that I am going to talk about and cover in this talk? Um, we'll briefly discuss what due diligence actually means for those who are not aware of that. Then you'll find out why you particularly should care about it, followed by how can you actually perform due diligence without driving yourself crazy or your team crazy, of course. Then I will describe the broad categories that you should always consider. Um, to go in depth or not really depends on a case by case basis, how much time you have, what's actually the risk of skipping one of those categories. And then in the end, I also want to leave you all with two questions. Oh, we'll also dive deep into each category. And then in the end, I will leave with you all with two questions, which I would like you all to ask yourself every single time you're bringing in a new library into the project. And then based on those questions, I think you can decide what will be a better approach for yourself. And then if we have time, I will also try to answer any questions, doubts. Will be happy to also accept any feedback from you all. And if that's done, we can start talking about what due diligence is. So due diligence with respect to third-party SDKs is the investigation or exercise of care, as I like to call, that a reasonable business or a developer is normally expected to take before entering into an agreement or a contract with another party. And you have to take a standard amount of care for that. Now, that's what a lawyer would call this definition of due diligence to be. I personally describe it as an insurance policy that you need for a third-party integration that you're about to make. Now, why you should care about it? If you love your business, your customers, your fellow developers, you'd want to be as cautious as you can when integrating with new libraries to avoid any harm to one, the quality of your app, second, the developer satisfaction, and most importantly, the business itself. Think of it like a visit to the dentist. No one really likes it, but it is so necessary to keep you healthy. How do you perform due diligence? In my personal experience, each team and person has their own way of analyzing things, and it also depends on what you are trying to achieve. So in this talk, I've tried to include most of the things that I believe could go wrong when bringing in a new library into your project. However, I would like to give a disclaimer that this is not an exhaustive list. So let's get an overview of the categories. The framework that I have come up with broadly covers 5 different categories on which we need to evaluate an SDK. The broad classification also helps splitting the responsibilities among multiple team members in case you actually want to do it in parallel. So the 5 categories that we have here are documentation, integration, customization, security, and performance. So the first and foremost thing that we should evaluate whenever we are looking at a new SDK or a third-party library is what does the documentation look like, right? This can be further classified into 5 different topics. The first one would be the licensing structure of the SDK that you're going to use. The second one would be installation and usage. Then the pitfalls, if the documentation already mentions any. What's the level of detail that the documentation goes into, and the frequency of updates. So what does the licensing structure mean here? As Android developers, most of the time, we're trying to look for open source solutions when we're trying not to reinvent the wheel, and we'll just try to pull that in. However, if you've paid attention for any and most of the open source libraries out there, you do see some sort of a license which is available on the readme.md file, which you can see usually on the GitHub page of the repository. Now, you might have come across different types of licenses. I'm not going to go into detail about each of those, but why do these certain types of licenses exist? I can briefly talk about the MIT and the Apache license. So the MIT license essentially says, do whatever you want, just don't sue me. And the Apache license says, do whatever you want, just don't sue me. But it just says that in many more words, as if a lawyer wrote that thing. Now, while this might not happen very often, certain open source projects don't like different licenses. An example here would be if you're trying to incubate your project into the Apache Software Foundation, they will have a hard rule in the incubation process that you cannot bring in proprietary software or dependencies into your project. So you have to make sure you use everything either from the Apache umbrella, or you make that dependency optional so that the person trying to use your library can still use it, but without any external licenses. And that's why these kind of things impact you. Where you can learn more about these licenses, you can head on to opensource.org/licenses, and it has a ton of information about this process. Next comes the installation and the usage. In this step, you will try to assess how are you going to install the library and use the library in your project. Is it going to be happening at the app startup, or is it going to be only when you actually need it? So can you instantiate it in a lazy manner? And what are the other steps that are needed? Do you need some sort of a build specific to this library? Do you need to compile it yourself? Things like that. And then is it always called on demand? For example, like an image loader, or do you actually need to have it running it or being injected at the very beginning of your project? An example of that would be a lot of libraries that do deep linking analytics. So they want to hook themselves into the app lifecycle as soon as it's possible. And does it require you to access the app context? Does it require activity context? Those kind of things are something that you will try to assess in this stage. And these are the important things to consider. Moving forward, what are the pitfalls? So here you'll be scanning special notes or gotchas in the documentation itself. For example, if a library needs camera permission and will not work without it, then you kind of have to make a decision whether or not you want to include this in your app. If your users have not given you a camera permission and this brings in a hard dependency on that, you might want to go with an alternative, right? Or a library might have a dependency on some sort of a push notification service. All of these things must be known before you actually start working with it so that you can actually document your decisions for people to know later on, and also for the leadership to be aware. And actually, if you don't find these things mentioned in the documentation, but discover this in future steps while working on it, it kind of is a red flag that you must consider seriously if you don't want yourself or your fellow developers to get frustrated along the process, because it then kind of feels like the developer or the vendor which is providing this library is not providing you with all the context. And in case things start to go south, you will have a hard time fighting those fires without a lack of good documentation. Moving forward, what's the level of detail that this documentation provide? Here, you should look at the code snippets. Do they show various scenarios, the way you can leverage the library? What kind of documentation exists now that we have various different forms of content which is readily available? Blogs, Java docs, videos, those kind of snippets, do they have that? And then how often is the documentation actually being updated? This directly will impact your velocity with which you can work. Example in this case would be, imagine you're trying to deal with a company in a different time zone, and while the integration is happening, you have a question about something. Uh, the people who are on the other side of the ocean may or may not be awake when you want that doubt resolved, and that make sure the documentation has a lot of detail in it so that you don't really need to go back and forth with people when you're doing those kind of integrations. And then comes the frequency of updates. Like I mentioned, this is another crucial thing to assess. A lot of times I have actually faced this issue where when a product is actually built, they make some documentation to woo the customers. However, what starts to happen is as more and more feature requests start to come in and you have tapped in a lot of clients, people stop focusing on updating the documentation or even adding documentation about the new features that they're building for their customers. And the documentation kind of lags behind a lot. In fact, in certain cases, I've seen videos of Android Studio on a completely different version, which does not match what we use today. And that documentation essentially becomes useless. And another thing to note here is if there are any major releases or breaking changes, are they being communicated to you in the form of that documentation or not? Moving forward to the next big item in the list is the integration step. At this point, you will already start diving into the code, either in a separate project to kind of build like a proof of concept, or directly doing it with your main project itself. And here I've divided this into 7 topics. The first one is consumption and delivery, dependencies, minimum SDK requirements, permissions, initialization, error handling and logging, and lastly, Proguard configuration. So consumption and delivery refers to the mechanism of actually pulling the dependency that you're trying to use into your project. Is it a jar or an AAR file that you need to drop into your libs folder? Or is it distributed to you via Maven or JCenter or some sort of a public distribution repository? An important thing here to consider is that do you have access to the historical versions of the SDK? In case you ever wanted to roll back to a version that was working for you, but an upgrade actually broke the experience in your app. Also, another recommendation here would be if you have or your company has an internal Artifactory or some sort of repository that hosts these kind of binaries, mirror these public distributions or whenever you're getting the binaries from the vendor, and keep those in your internal Artifactory. Worst come worst, if you don't have any of that infrastructure set up, I would still recommend having at least those snapshots saved in a Google Drive or a Dropbox somewhere for you to have access to in case something goes wrong in future. The next step that you're looking at is dependencies within the integration. Now, dependencies here refer to the library's third-party dependencies. So this will actually have an impact on your project, mostly because of the size or certain things might break. So what are the dependencies that this library is bringing with itself? And the impact it can have on your project in certain other parts of your app. So if the dependency surface can be minimized, try to opt for that. The next one would be the minimum SDK requirements. I think because probably we're all Android developers here, this is pretty straightforward. Certain libraries might just straight up ask you to bump the min SDK version for your project and build against that. And this could actually be a deal breaker for you at times, especially if you're working at a large company where you're trying to support like a lot of old devices as well. This is not very often the case nowadays, but something you cannot rule out. So this is something that you should have at the back of your mind always. The next thing would be permissions. Again, pretty straightforward. Certain libraries would require access to certain hardware or certain set of permissions, for example, location, camera, mic, all of those things. If your app, like I mentioned already, does not already have access to those permissions, it might be a big change. In fact, certain permissions also break the auto update behavior. So this is something that you'll have to consider and should be an important consideration for you. And you might to your users in a way that the user experience does not really break. So a lot of conversations with the design team and product need to happen in parallel for this step. The next thing would be initialization itself, like we've already discovered in the documentation phase where you went over how are you going to integrate or like initialize this library. Now will be the time to actually put it into practice and see if the installation actually happens as the documentation suggested, or do you have to make any workarounds or things to actually make it work. Lastly, I think it will be the error handling and the logging that the library provides. Here, you will have to assess how are the errors and warnings logged, what is the granularity of information that you have access to, and you also have to make sure that none of this is actually logged or leaked in production. That will be the worst things possible. And then, again, since we're Android developers, Proguard configuration is something you might want to add because certain SDKs like you to add those kind of things. And some Proguard rules, as you may or may not know, can mess up with your builds or even the binaries that you publish. So make sure to double check things that might break in your release or with any of your build setups. Proguard configuration is another thing a lot of people don't think about when they're bringing in a library, and then it kind of impacts closer to when you're actually trying to ship the feature. The next broader category is customization. Now that you've actually integrated the SDK in some manner, either through your POC or the main project itself, it is time to see what level of customization can you actually achieve with this. This is mostly in terms of the user interface, trying to please your designers and also making sure that your branding is actually reflected and used across the app, and the flow that you're trying to incorporate, if any, is not breaking that at all. And the topics in this broad category are localization, accessibility, user interface configurability, user experience configurability, and then dark mode compatibility. The first thing that we're going to discuss is localization. This relates to the ability to localize your apps. If the SDK offers you a user interface, you must know if the SDK already comes with translations, or do they actually provide any support for you to provide the translations if your app is actually supported in multiple languages. And also, does the SDK work fine when you switch to RTL languages? For example, Arabic is something going to change out of the box. And if not directly, at least the SDK should provide you a way to override the strings somehow to manually handle the localization at your end itself. The next thing is accessibility. And like the name suggests, it relates to the ability to make your apps accessible for your users. Again, if the SDK has any sort of UI, you must try to get an answer to the question if it handles accessibility correctly or not. If not, is there any support that they provide that you can actually do changes so that it handles accessibility? Again, if your app is targeted towards the users and you actually try to care about accessibility, this would be an important consideration for you. The next one would be UI configurability itself. Since we're talking about customization, this refers to the fact that at what level can you customize a UI? For example, if they're offering you a button to launch a particular flow, Can you customize the text of that button? Can you customize the color of the button? Can you customize the button shape itself or the background resources? And all those things fall under this category. Why or how would this impact you is if your app uses a particular theme or branding, then another SDK should allow you to apply those kind of things to that flow. Otherwise, it's just going to look very weird. And if it doesn't offer that, this would be an opportunity for you to reach out to the vendor teams and ask if they're flexible, allowing you to give support for that or not. And this usually could be a make or break for major organizations, and hence you should look at that pretty early on in the process. The next one is pretty similar. This is the user experience itself. So if, for example, you're working on a SDK which allows you to do some sort of a verification at multiple steps, or if it allows you to apply filters to your pictures or do some sort of video editing that you don't want to build out yourself, because it's going to be a multi-step process. For example, capturing the video, trimming it, applying certain filters to it, and then eventually rendering it. So you are going to go through multiple screens. What level of customization does the SDK offer you to control those flows? Can you actually omit certain steps from there or not? And then are you allowed to change the flow as per your needs? Do you get sufficient callbacks at every step of the process to understand how the users are actually using the SDK within your app, mostly for analytics purposes, and also to see if what you aim to achieve with this SDK is happening or not. And that's where the UX configurability comes into play. And the last one would be dark mode compatibility. This is another nifty thing that your app might be supporting now. And sometimes if the SDK itself does not have that kind of a theming support, it might look odd when the users switch to a dark theme and then they suddenly see the whole app performing in a certain way, and then one of the screens or one of the flows performing in another way. If the UI looks weird, this is again something that you should probably check with the vendor about. Then we move on to the next category, which is security. And this would raise a lot of eyebrows when you discuss this topic within the company, especially legal would be interested in knowing about this, or your security team, the AppSec or InfoSec engineers. And here's what you have to cover broadly in the security aspect. So what happens to the data collection, data storage, data communication, and then the data encryption. And the last two options here are tracking and personally identifiable information collection, storage, and communication. So what does the data collection refer to? Data collection here refers to the fact that when you're integrating an SDK, what all information is this SDK going to persist or collect from your app, either as a user input or based on whatever it's doing in the background, in the foreground, whenever it's called. And how does it impact you is you have to know whatever data this is collecting, because there are a lot of regulations around the world now that kind of hold you accountable for any and everything that you collect on the users. And they want to make sure that it is not being misused, it is not being sold, and if needed, users can actually request you to delete that. So unless you have visibility over the fact what all is being collected, this kind of compliance will be very hard for your team or company to achieve. Data storage, again, refers to the fact that the data that is being collected by the SDK, where is it being stored, if at all it is being stored? Is it only going to be in memory while the app is being used? Do they actually cache it on the device in the file storage? Or when you move on to the next step, is it actually being transported out of the app to their server or to some other place? And if that is happening, is that communication happening through a secured channel? Are proper SSL certificates being used? Are they using HTTPS or not? Those kind of things should be covered under this topic. And again, how does it impact you is the same reason. You want to make sure that anything that SDK knows about is handled in a safe and secure manner, and you are completely aware of it should there ever be an audit. And then if you are going to persist the data on the device per se, Is it encrypted or not? This is what this talks about. Obviously, if you're taking it out from the device to another server, if doesn't matter if it's yours or that vendor's, you have to ask the question, are you actually hashing it, encrypting it or not? The next thing here is the tracking. So apart from offering normal functionality, as developers, uh, product builders, anyone, everybody wants to know how their SDKs or products are performing. So in addition to whatever tracking you do in your apps, these SDKs might as well add some sort of tracking ability to learn about the user behavior or just for certain sort of metrics to improve the SDK itself. This is very important for you to know what all is being tracked. Are users, both the company and the end user, are they being given a choice to actually opt out of tracking or not? If not, this could be a problem in certain countries. European Union has laws against that. Or if you're trying to get some sort of compliances, then again, this could be a problem. If you're not allowing your users to opt out of that tracking, this could be a deal breaker. So it would be good to have visibility on that topic as well. And then last is the PII handling. If that SDK, which most of the time does not happen, but if at all this SDK deals with any sort of personally identifiable information, how are they handling that? And are there proper mechanisms set in that regard? Now, what PII actually refers to is any sort of information that can help identify a person. So example here would be a pin code. If I were to say out a pin code out loud, it might not be able to identify someone personally. However, if I were to add some more information along with that pin code, it can actually start to narrow down my search. And at some point of time, I can start finding out people with that information. So certain times, certain types of data, when present in isolation, may not be considered PII, but when you look at it together with more information, this becomes PII. And that's why certain SDKs are pretty smart about collecting different things from different places and then joining all of that at the backend to circumvent around these things. So PII handling is also something that you will have to understand and know and be aware of in case something were to happen to your company and lawyers being called about the problems. Then we move on to performance, and it has 7 topics. Under this, the first one is build performance. Then we'll look at the APK and the bundle size, depends on what you're using for your product. Startup time, memory and disk usage, networking, battery, and user interface. So all of those things, but in regards to performance. The first one would be the build performance. So this, again, does not happen most of the time. However, there are SDKs that are going to bring in annotation processors just to make your life a bit easier. And if you're working on a big project, and if you've ever tried to listen to what the build engineers rant about all the time, are a lot of annotation processors, because they tend to slow down your builds. So if that is something that this SDK or integration is going to do, you would want to check with your build team, CI team, whatever, whosoever manages that, that I am integrating this SDK. This will bring in these sort of dependencies on the build system, and this is going to be the impact on the build. Obviously, an integration should not affect your team's velocity negatively, and that's why looking at the builds in terms of an SDK integration is also really important. The next thing would be the APK or app bundle size. What this essentially means is if you're bringing in an SDK, is it actually increasing the app size at any level? Why that matters is for developing nations or countries where the devices are still not very modern or don't have a lot of space, app size can actually matter for users. And a very good example here is Tinder. a lot of people download Tinder, use it for a while. Maybe they find someone, maybe they don't. They uninstall it, and then they install it again. So if you kind of do all of those things over and over again, app size kind of starts playing a role, especially if data is not cheap in the place where you're trying to download these apps. Hence, having the impact measured for the APK size is important for you when you're doing the integration. Then the next thing would be the startup time. This would be dependent on how the SDK is actually initialized. So when you're doing the investigation in the beginning phases of when the installation happens, does the SDK need to be installed or initialized or instantiated at the app startup, or can you defer the initialization? This would actually tie back to the startup time performance. If the SDK has a lot of analytics or something that it needs to fire up as soon as you inject it and it starts tracking things, then it might slow down your app startup. And if there is a way to defer those things, I think you should be aware of that. If startup time is what you care about or you're already struggling with, you would not want to make it worse at all. The next thing would be memory and disk usage. This, again, would be very specific to certain types of SDKs. A very clear example that comes to my mind is SDKs that are either dealing with videos or images. And if you're trying to use those SDKs and they are trying to be smart by caching a lot of those things for you, what's the impact on the memory? And then what's the impact on the disk usage? So certain people I've seen just initialize the SDK and say, oh, we want all sorts of caches. There is no purging strategy that they declare. And then after a while, they say, oh, my app is actually occupying 300 megabytes. I don't even know it's a very simple app. And when you go in and look, most of it is just the cache that one of the SDKs is using. So this is another thing to have an eye on and know about your apps and also the SDK. If they're going to leverage any sort of cache, what are the strategies they offer you to invalidate that cache, if at all? Then the next thing would be networking. If your SDK performs any sort of network requests, you want to make sure the network requests don't happen too often. The SDK is not transporting unnecessary amount of data there. Again, if your app is being used in certain types of markets where data is costly, this sort of performance will come into play. Most of the time, this is never a problem. But again, I feel that this is something that could be problematic for certain cases where you have a large set of users, or if your app is being used quite frequently. Chat applications are a good example of that. Their network performance will be an important factor to consider when doing an integration. Again, tying networking and wake locks with battery. So if the SDK kind of relies on push notifications or networking or those kind of things, it might start adding to the battery. The problem right now is I don't think Android supports information at the SDK level, or like you can easily pinpoint those kind of things. But something to consider is when you're integrating those kind of things, have some sort of a snapshot or like a baseline measured for how much battery on an average or P90 levels is your app consuming. And if you make that integration, when you roll it out, do you see any spikes or like the graphs going up? That could be an indicator of the fact that this SDK is doing something wrong. And why you need to care about it is because Android has over the years started penalizing apps for this. In fact, Samsung at some point of time also says that this app is consuming too much battery. Do you want to kill it from the background? So you never want an SDK to put your app in that situation. And that's why battery performance is also an important consideration when you're analyzing SDKs. And last but not the least, if the SDK comes with a user interface, you want to make sure it performs as smooth as possible and there are no janks whatsoever. Doesn't matter what kind of a device it's running on, it should be smooth, should not hamper with any sort of UI issues or lags whenever the user is interacting with the flow of the SDK itself. And then the two questions that I would like to share with the team here that I would like you all to think. Again, it is a very case-by-case thing. The first one is, can you actually leverage dynamic delivery? So now Google Play actually allows you to deliver features, modules dynamically, so that if all users don't need a certain set of features, you can only give it to the people who actually want to use that feature. And in those cases, you can actually save certain types of resources and even the code, which is not going to run on someone's device. And can you leverage dynamic delivery with your features, especially these kind of integrations? And then the next one would be, can you prevent tight coupling on the SDK? For example, if you're trying to use some sort of an image loading or an image modification or a video editing library, maps are another example. Can you prevent your features from being tightly coupled? Can you have an abstraction layer which is in between the SDK and your app? So that if in future you want to move to an alternative, you could swap out those implementations without going crazy. And again, these are the two things that are very specific to certain situations. That's why you will not most of the time care about those, but still something to have at the back of your mind when you're performing your due diligence with the SDKs. And then I would like to say, if you want to know how we flip ones and zeros, basically bits at Tinder, we have a blog at medium.com/Tinder engineering with some interesting posts that we put up there. And if you're interested in working with us, you could check out life@tinder.com. And if you want to connect with me, I'm available on Twitter most of the time to answer questions, get any feedback, provide feedback on anything. And with that, if you have any questions, I would be happy to answer those. Thank you for being such a patient audience, and thank you for being there. I know a lot of people are in a very different time zone. So again, a big thank you to Shalom and Fez for giving me the opportunity to speak at Android Worldwide.
Thank you, Ishan, for that super comprehensive talk. All right. So looks like we have quite a few questions already, so we might as well just jump in here.
Oh, I see. Okay, so there's a Q&A tab. Okay, so the first question is, did you ever have to roll back an SDK integration due to these problems? How did you pivot? Did you build your own solution? I've had to roll back to a lower version of a certain SDK. I will not try to name the SDK here. And yeah, without giving out too much information, the problem happened when we updated certain things in the app. We rolled it out. No problem happened until the vendor itself decided to make certain changes, because of which people could not log into our apps. So again, without saying which vendor it was, because people could not log into these apps, technically our business is suffering, right? The fix that was told to us was either it's going to be deployed later on or whatever, but because our business was shut, we wanted to do a hot fix. And the only way to do that was to downgrade that SDK version. Now, because we already had those binaries saved in our Artifactory, we were immediately able to ship that thing out. But it has happened, and it is very much a possibility. So you always want to have a rollback strategy, especially because the apps are not so easy to upgrade, downgrade. And it is not like a web page that you just deploy and then the changes go out. So that's why rollback strategy should always be thought through in this case. How do you handle Android's process death with SDKs? Okay, is Gabor here?
Gabor, I don't think is here, so this is very obviously someone trying to impersonate him. So I'll leave it up to you. There is no need to actually answer that question. But
no, I mean, this is something that you would certainly try out, right? And it's not just about the SDK. you would first take a step back and see how process death is handled across your app, right? And if your app can handle it, I think the SDK comes pretty late. But it, again, ties back to the fact that what sort of caching or data storage that the SDK offers. An example here would be if your user were to be in a flow where they're editing an image or a video, trying to trim it down, and suddenly they background the app and the app gets killed. When the user comes back, is the SDK capable of maintaining that state? That's how you would understand if your SDK is capable of handling the process death or not. The next thing would be at Tinder, do you write proposal with all of these points to consider? Have you had instance where you didn't move forward with an SDK? Yes. So at Tinder, at GetAround, at Booking, all the places I worked, they had a process already established even before where you have to write a library proposal whenever you're bringing in a new library. And that's sort of what was the foundation of this talk. All of these companies that I worked at had different set of questions in that proposal document. And I kind of try to club all of those questions into this framework that I've been asked. And not just the questions that were in the template, but after you submit that, people come up with more edge cases. For example, someone just asked, does this SDK actually handle process death? Now, because this might not apply to every single SDK out there, it might not be a part of your template. But yes, we have a proposal template that we fill out. And has there ever been an instance where we didn't move forward with an SDK? I believe I've never seen an instance where we did not move forward with an SDK. However, I would like to point out certain times there are problems with an SDK that you already know. It is good to list that as a risk. That sure, we are integrating this SDK, but these are the risks based on what your risk tolerance is, what the SDK has to offer. If you're comfortable taking that risk, you will go back and integrate that. If not, certainly people can say, oh, we don't want to integrate this SDK for those reasons. And that's why you have those proposal templates or documents so that other team members, managers, and senior leadership can also view those things. One thing I would like to mention on the template proposal thing, this may not be possible to do all the time, but if you have a template or a proposal, make sure that those things are filled out before you establish a contract with the vendor. Because if the leadership has actually made a contract with the vendor, then doesn't matter what your investigation says, the answer will always be a yes, we are integrating no matter what happens. If there are any risks, we are willing to take those. At Tinder, which team is responsible for introducing SDKs and maintaining their updates? Who has ownership of it? Very nice question. There is no one team that is responsible for maintaining all of those SDKs. For example, I work in the trust and safety team. I have another colleague who works in another team that deals with user growth. And we both have actually, in the last 1 year, integrated certain SDKs into our apps. And the ownership lies on us. Whenever it has to be updated, whatever has to be done for those things, because our team leverages those SDKs, we own them. Can another team come in and update those SDKs if they need? For sure. But integrating an SDK and passing it on to, for example, a platform team, some sort of an infra team is usually a bad approach. And you should not do that because the team that is bringing that in has most of the context of why in the first place did you make a decision. Obviously, if you can document that in a proposal, then it's really nice. And anyone can then go in and update those things and take ownership. But the teams that introduce the SDKs, the developers that bring that in, usually are responsible for maintaining those. The next one would be, how do you assess data collection for an SDK? That isn't something I've seen in docs. So data collection, I think prior to one of the projects that I did at Booking.com, I never really thought about it. I didn't even know that this was a concern. I was doing a lot of privacy engineering work at Booking for compliance and also GDPR regulations and stuff. That's where by talking to a lot of product managers and a bunch of stakeholders from the legal team, I started learning about what are the implications of certain types of data. For how long can you persist the data? What are the options that we can give to the user to actually get rid of the data if they don't want to use our product anymore? And if those things are not, and they are not usually mentioned at the SDK level, the documentation level, you really need to talk to the developers or if you're dealing with a proper vendor, a proprietary vendor, you would talk to their technical consultants or the salespeople. We want to know what all data does your SDK try to access, what all does it persist, and you have to make sure that those things are run by your legal team and your leadership. This is not something that will always be available in the documentation. You have to take some initiatives and steps and do some digging on your own, to be honest. Do you have some kind of an RFC proposal system for introducing SDKs at Tinder? Yes, like I mentioned, we have a document which asks a bunch of high-level questions. And then once you've answered those questions, they go to the platform team, and then also a bunch of senior staff engineers who are going to review and approve that thing. And once that's there, I think the SDK is good to come in as a dependency. Obviously, there are some concerns people could raise. You have to address those. If they're not addressable by you, then you put them as risks. And if the team is comfortable with those risks, you move forward with that. Which SDK do you use for A/B testing? Well, we have a custom in-house solution at Tinder. At Booking as well, we had an in-house solution. But I've used Firebase remote configs for A/B testing. And then there are a bunch of other SDKs out there that you can use. So I'm not really sure like what this question is trying to guess, but we have our in-house solution for A/B testing at the moment.
All right, looks like that's all of the questions. Well, thank you again, Ishan, for that talk.